please welcome Nora Young.
We find ourselves at this extraordinarily challenging time at the moment. And I'm sure as we reflect back, there'll be many lessons from our experience of the pandemic. But for our purposes this evening, I'd just like to reflect on the importance of data. The availability of large amounts of good data, constantly updated, has helped drug researchers come up with vaccines, helped regulators to assess the safety of those vaccines, and policymakers to decide where to prioritize doses of those vaccines. Various supply chain shortages that we've seen over the course of this situation remind us that sure, we need to be lean and efficient, but we also need to be resilient and sustainable in the face of dramatic, unpredictable change. That means being able to adapt and shift course as things change. And access to large amounts of data and the analytics to make use of that data will be crucial in adapting in a resilient, sustainable way to the challenges of the future. And that's what I want to talk about this evening, the data-driven technological changes coming our way, the potential benefits, but also the real challenges we need to face if we're to design the equitable future that we want. Okay, so these data trends that I'm talking about. The first trend is simply mapping the body. Because in addition to our phones, we have these purpose-built devices. If you yourself don't wear a fitness tracker like a Fitbit, you probably know somebody who does. Having spent the last year pretty much in my home, my Fitbit has not been getting out much of a workout lately, but nonetheless, I do wear one. Technologies that were once used in medical contexts or for elite athletes are now everyday tools for weekend warriors or people just curious about their bodies. And as we track our movements, we open the door to questions not just about privacy in general, but about differential access to privacy. If you can afford to buy products where the business model is charging people for a physical product like an iPhone or a Fitbit, you're getting more robust privacy than if you're using a free or cheap app that relies on targeted ads or selling your data. And we can see the practical use for this physical tracking in the pandemic with the COVID alert app the federal government came out with that uses Bluetooth and an anonymous system to notify people of potential exposure to the virus. And importantly, and I'll come back to this a bit later, we can design these systems that have an awareness of proximity without relying on privacy compromising location tracking. However, as we also see from this example, using these tools effectively requires mass adoption. But what I want us to think about is what happens when we actively try to harness that cultural trend towards self-reporting, towards gathering and sharing data, but in the service of something more significant than sharing pictures of our lunch. So Ushahidi is an open source platform that was created in the wake of the post-election violence that happened in Kenya, just, I guess, a little over 10 years ago now. And what it did is it's an open source platform that let people send text messages reporting episodes of violence, which would then be automatically plotted on a map as a way of bearing witness to what was going on and presumably to see where violence might be headed. It was a very successful tool, which required people to do exactly the sort of self-reporting that they do when they take pictures of their food, using the tools that were ready to hand, their phones, and using a behavior that many people had in Kenya at the time, which was text messaging. Since then, the same Ushahidi technology has been used for crisis mapping all over the world to monitor elections in India, Lebanon, and Pakistan, to monitor extreme weather events in the US, and more. And crucially, Ushahidi isn't some top-down government program. It was literally the idea of 3 bloggers who had a good idea. And since then, the platform has been used over 90,000 times, 90,000 separate deployments in crises all over the world. So there's value in the data, I hope I've convinced you, but there are also things that we need to watch out for to use it effectively and fairly, and some of these concerns are really important. The first, I think, is trust and transparency. We've seen that the culture of this technological shift is that many of us have an appetite to gather our data, and that if we perceive a benefit, we're willing to share that data. But that requires trust and transparency. Is the data being used for anything that customers or citizens would be disturbed by if they knew? For example, Vice recently reported that Customs and Border Protection in the US has been buying up commercial location data, the kind of data gathered by all those apps that we love to use, which was collated by a data broker called Ventel. Customs and Border Protection has been using it without a warrant to track Americans. So what are the ethics for managing customer or citizen data? What are the ethics around transparency? What should you know about how your data is being used? And what's the responsibility of governments to ensure that that information is provided to citizens? Especially since so many of us don't actually really understand how our data is packaged and sold. This next one, I think, is probably the most important as we think about the future of AI, and that is the potential bias in all this data. Data sets are, by definition, not capturing all of reality. Otherwise, they would just be reality. So we need to be mindful of that, in particular when using machine learning, because remember, machine learning AI works by training the machine learning systems on large data sets. There are actually two pitfalls that we need to be aware of when it comes to bias. One is that the data sets are not representative. So this is a famous, notorious example. Amazon had a hiring learning algorithm that was trained on data sets of previous Amazon engineers to go out and find prospective new hires. But because their previous engineers tended to be men, guess what? The learning algorithm ended up filtering out women engineers as potential candidates. So that's one obvious way that we need to think about the problem of bias in data. The second pitfall is one that Princeton scholar Ruha Benjamin enlightened me on, that even if the data is representative, it can still produce bias. Her example was a healthcare algorithm used in the US that was basically doing digital triage, and it was specifically aimed at producing fair results. However, the designers used cost of care as training data, figuring cost of care historically was a good proxy for which conditions were the most serious and ought to get the most attention. But that inadvertently flagged white patients to get more care because historically, white Americans use more healthcare dollars than African Americans. Per Professor Benjamin, this is not an issue that requires technical expertise as much as an issue requiring expertise in culture, history, and social science. To end on a final good news note, I think that the era of the Wild West of data is the new oil data grab is very likely ending. I think we've been through a kind of crazy period where the data and the technology started taking off at such a rate that we didn't really realize how serious the potential consequences of this data boom might be. The regulatory environment around data is changing as people realize the consequences of the misuse of data. So we have the European Union coming out with the GDPR, for example. Post-Cambridge Analytica, there's increasingly skepticism about the trustworthiness of social media and the so-called FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, of Silicon Valley big tech. There's been open talk about breaking up Facebook. A little while ago, the US Department of Justice launched an antitrust suit against Google. In the US, the federal government and many states' attorneys general put forth antitrust lawsuits against Facebook. So the tide, I think, is definitely turning. And I think the sea change in how we think about the ethics of data is an opportunity for Canada, for Canadian businesses, for Canadian institutions, and for Canadian communities. We already live in a more regulated, privacy-respecting data environment than our US neighbors. There's a great opportunity for being on the right side of this, for being a trusted steward of people's data. And I want us to think about the role of public institutions like UBC in this kind of context. If it's really true that this data is potentially of great social value, what role do our public institutions have in helping to develop that, helping to foster it in a way that incorporates all of those values that we were talking about, the trust and the transparency, the vigilance over making sure there isn't bias in data, making sure that it's ethically used, responsibly used, and used in the public good. The data boom is not going away, and it's easy to be fearful of all of that data because there are scary aspects of it. It's very, very powerful, but the powerful potential for good is there too. And so what I hope will go away is the Wild West that we've experienced in the last decade, and that we'll be able to embrace the potential for this new technology while keeping the scarier parts in check. There are technical challenges before us, there are privacy challenges before us, but I truly believe that if we get the technology right and we get the privacy right, we can do some amazing things. I want to thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to UBC Okanagan.